You can reduce this many files and this amount of code to a single line of code when you have a lot of entities to manage. In this video, I will show you how to use the NgRx Data extension. If you watched the first video in this series, we had to make the store with all of its reducers. Then we had to make a lot of actions for each action that we are going to do, right? And then a lot of reducers and also selectors. And in the second video, we also made the effects that are going to communicate with the backend to make a complete circle in the Redux pattern using the NgRx library. If you remember the graph from the first video, we basically had to make each and every part of the NgRx circle, so the store, the reducers, the actions, selector, and the effects that are going to communicate with the services. The NgRx data is an abstraction that is built on top of those store effects and entity that reduces the amount of code that we need to write for simple entities. So instead of writing everything that we've written in several videos, in several previous videos, we only need to write one of these methods, like get all or delete or add. And the extension will do all the heavy work for us. It has the built-in actions, selectors, effects, reducers, and everything. This is actually a very good documented part of the NgRx, so the documentation here is very clear and easy to follow, because in essence it automates a lot of configuration and definition of the store that we had to do manually before. So all the effects and all the reducers and everything, as I mentioned, it all comes out of the box. So we gain some simplicity, but some of the work is actually being hidden from us, and also probably some of the control as well, because things are now happening automatically. However, NgRx Data is not taking away anything from the NgRx store. It's not a replacement. It is just another layer of abstraction that we can use when needed. And when we don't need it, or where we have the requirements to change things manually, we can just use the NgRx the regular way. So it's not a replacement or an alternative. It's just a tool to help us in some situations, like a majority of the tools are. But first I have to mention some limitations before you get all excited about this extension like I did when I found out about it. There are some limitations and also some requirements, and most of them are not the problems I have encountered in my projects, at least not on the tasks that I needed to do with the NgRx data. But one of the biggest limitations, or one of the biggest requirements for the NgRx data is, and we've used this in our previous videos when we were using the Google Books APIs, is actually that this response that comes from Google is not normalized. It is containing the entities under these items here, which means that the entities are not the top level citizens in this response. The Google API actually contains also information about the pagination under the root level. So we have these key items here that actually contains all of our entities. And this is one of the things that's not supported by NgRx extension, at least not that I could find the easy way to do it. Because to get this to work is almost not worth the trouble, as you would basically have to change every part of the extension, so you might just as well do it manually rather than relying on this extension. So because we cannot use this Google API that we used in previous example, I will actually quickly make one fake backend that will just normalize this data, and it will return us this data, these books from Google on a root level from that. So for that, I will be using the JSON server library that you can just Google, basically JSON server. And here we can see how it's used. It's very easy to use, so we just need to install it globally. And once it is installed, we need to make one database JSON file that will basically fake our data, or it will listen to this key here, to this endpoint on the API, and it will return what we have put inside that file. And for that, I can just copy basically several items from the Google, and I will just put them inside one file here in root that I'm going to call database.json. Now these are the books that are coming from the Google. I need to surround this JSON, these items, with another level as displayed here inside documentation. So we need to make this as posts, or in our case the products, because that's what we are calling our books, the products. And if I close this one, we now have 4 books that are being listed inside of our fake server. And I just noticed that these two have the same ID. That is probably some Google thing that will not work because this library, one of the requirements is that each entity needs a unique ID field so that the library can manage them. And now if I would just run this server by watching this database file, if we open that, we can see that we are basically getting our books in the root of the response by calling the products here. So there are 4 books coming from our server. And now we can start with implementation. So to implement this NgRx data, we can just look at the documentation. And inside the overview, we can see that we need to define the entities first. So that is basically one entity metadata TypeScript file that will contain the definition of what kind of entities are we expecting from the backend. We can define several of them. I will just make this entity metadata file inside of our root because it can contain multiple entities, entity types, but it can be in a feature module. It's just a TypeScript file, so it's not that important. And I'll just copy everything from here and then adjust it for our needs. So instead of hero, we are going to need the product. Let's import the entity metadata. However, I cannot import it because I didn't actually even install this library. So first thing first, we need to install it, and the installation is done by just using the npm or yarn or whatever you're using, the ng for example. And if I paste it in, the npm will install the NgRx data extension. Of course, you need the NgRx base extension for this to work. And now I can import this entity metadata map. And here inside the product, we can put some parameters so that we can change the entity name that is going to be mapped towards the backend. In our case, I just made it the same as we have it here. That's matching these products. The library will even take care of the product and products, so the plural names will be correct. But you can change that if you wish. You can define here the plural names. We don't need that basically, but we can say that product is actually products just to have it similar. And we don't need anything here for the configuration. And now we need to register the entity store basically. And we can see here that it requires to have the store module configured and the effects module. And one thing that is not mentioned anywhere, but you need to put the entity data module last behind the effects module and store module, because if you do it in a different order, it will not send anything to the backend and you will lose a lot of time figuring out why it's not working. Don't ask me how I know. Let's just put this entity data module here inside our app module at the very end. So after our effects, and we need to import all these classes. One thing to note is that we have already store module with our meta reducers and root reducers. We can actually remove this now because our products are now going to be working with the NgRx data. So if I remove this, I have to provide actually the empty object for users. And the next thing is to create some entity data service. And this service allows us to overwrite some of the functionality from the NgRx data, to extend it, to redefine it. However, it can work practically without this. But let's just make one hero service TypeScript, not the hero, but rather the product service. And here we are going to export one class that will extend the entity collection service base. And instead of the hero here, we are going to provide the product. And let's import all other necessary libraries. And here we will basically tell the NgRx data that for the product, we want to use this service elements factory. We can again extend a lot of these things, but depending on the level of configuration you need, you might as well either work without NgRx data or adjust your backend so that it fits to what the frontend is expecting. Then this service has some hero service that actually needs to be the product service. It has the mentioned methods that we talked about so that we can just use this product service to get all the entities from the backend. Now let's see what is going on with our application. Maybe it's working. Still nothing. That's because we are not even calling this service. So if I would now to call this method that will retrieve all the entities inside of our smart component here, the list display component. So I can do what they are doing basically. we can get the entities and the loading state here inside of constructor. So we don't need this store anymore. And we can just say that these products are hero, not the hero entities, but it should be the private product service, right? The one that we've just made. This product service will then give us all the entities and all the loading parameters. Let's create this field for the loading observer or the observable, and that will show us when the NgRx data library is doing something on the backend, when the effects are active. Now on the init, we can just call this product service, and we can see that we have the get all, or even get with query, get one, etc. We will start with get all just to see what's going on. If we try our application now, and if we go to our products module, we can see that it is actually trying to call the /API/products endpoint, even without us configuring anything inside of our service. We don't need to tell it where it should look. It will by default go to the /API and /products in this case, because that's our entity definition. However, in our case, our backend is not on localhost 4200. It is actually on the localhost 3000. So we need to tell this NgRx Data extension where we want it to look for the data, because sometimes our API will be on a maybe different server or on different endpoint than what they're expecting, and that is very easy to extend. We can just follow the documentation for that and go with the entity data service, which is basically doing the communication with the backend. And we can see that we can here have the default data service configuration, where we can put some different parameters like the root of the web server that we are going to use or the timeout. And if I would just to put that inside of our, for example, app modules for now, it doesn't matter. Of course, you can put it where it suits most for your project. And here, instead of this sample, we are going to provide the local host 3000. And we can remove this request timeout. Let's use the default. And if I would to refresh now, let's see what happens. There is an error. And that is because I'm not even providing this data service config. And that is being done by using this object that will basically tell our application that when it is expecting to use the default data service config, we are going to provide this our value that we've just initialized here. So this, even though they have a similar name, we can just change the name to make it more clearer. So we can say that provide default data service configuration, and then use value. We can just call it custom data service configuration, and that will be this one here. So we are just overwriting the default configuration that our NgRx data library is using. And if we go now to our website, we can see that it is getting the 4 books that we've copied, the 2 similar ones, and the 4th, and it is fetching that from the products localhost 3000/products, our fake JSON backend. And that is basically all there is needed to installing and to use this extension without us having to write a single reducer, single action, single selector, no effects, nothing. That is why it's very easy to use the NgRx data, as long as our project and our problem fits inside those limitations that it has. So now, instead of having to use all these actions here, we can just remove these actions, delete the file completely. We can then remove these effects that are communicating with the backend. And we can even remove this reducer index file and remove the reducer itself and all the selectors that come with it. And we will get a lot of import problems because we just deleted the files. But if I quickly remove these product actions, expectations, and if I would remove this code that we used before and all these imports from there, we can see that our products are being retrieved. And that is all done by the NgRx data extension by default. So it's doing a lot of heavy lifting behind the scenes. Of course, again, adding to reading list and removing from reading list, it's a different part of our store. So we would need actions and things for that. But for the retrieving the data, we can just use the get all. We can just, when we need to update the data back to the server, then we can just use this method called update, or we can even delete from the backend or add a new hero. So it's basically a most useful tool for the C.R.U.D, the typical create, read, update, and delete operations that we might do on the backend. If you're making the administration part of your application, for example, where all these methods can be used. There are several more. For example, in our case, here we had the search, if you recall. So using this search will basically require us to provide some get parameters with our request. And for that, we can use this, not this get all, but we can use the get with query here in the data services, and then we can provide the query parameters. So let's quickly just do that to show how it's used. So instead of our app module here, our component using the get all, we can provide the get with query, and then we can provide that the query parameter q should have the value of NgRx, for example, or something that we are providing from our application. And then we can relist all those values and parameters, and we can see that the q value here is being actually appended to our query. So we can see that it's being called with that additional parameter so that the server can filter our data. And this is a similar way you would do the backend pagination. Again, assuming that your backend is actually following this clean way of returning entities and not the nested way as the Google Books is returning here. So you cannot have several levels of it. Maybe you can easily make it to work. I never had a need to use this library that deep. So again, this library is very useful if you're making, for example, administration for your own systems, where it can save you a lot of time if you have several of the API points with the entities that are provided in a similar fashion. You can just quickly put something on the front end that will list, delete, and update and add new entities inside of your API. So I hope that this was useful. Like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. And here is a joke for you.